Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this installment of the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta's monthly webcast series. My name is Sarisha Ganta, and I'm Counsel and Education Director with Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. Today, we'll be talking about festivals, carnivals, and taste of events. This is part 3 in a 3-part series that we have on fundraising events. The first 2 installments were auctions and galas and outdoor sporting events like golf tournaments and road races. Speaking today are Richard Litwin and Robin Miller. We are so excited to have them speaking today on this topic. Richard focuses his practice on state and local tax controversies, including sales tax, local county taxes, corporate income tax, property tax, and basically anything tax in Georgia. He was selected as a Georgia super lawyer and to PBPA. He's a superman with all the sales tax and property tax help he has provided to our clients. And Robin Miller is PBPA Senior Corporate and Tax Counsel. She has over 25 years of corporate and tax exempt law experience. So between the two of them, they know basically everything there is to know about today's topic. Thank you, Richard and Robin, for joining today. Before they jump into the substance of today's topic, I wanted to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta and our mission. Our mission is to provide free legal services to community-based nonprofits that serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals. The way we're able to do this is by connecting the nonprofits with eligible volunteer attorneys who are from the leading corporations and law firms of Atlanta. Our clients are 501c3 nonprofits located and serving the greater Atlanta area. The nonprofits serve low-income and disadvantaged individuals and are otherwise unable to afford legal services. If you meet these eligibility requirements and if you're interested in applying to be a client, please visit our website and there you can fill in a request for legal assistance. Also on our website, we have a ton of amazing resources, including previous webcasts, articles, and podcasts. And just a reminder before we get into today's topic, this is just general information. It is not specific legal advice. If you have specific questions about your organization, do reach out to an attorney. And today's presentation is copyrighted by PBPA. And now I'll turn it over to you, Robin.
Thank you, Sarisha, so much. Good morning, everyone. I want to quickly just cover the agenda so that you're aware of sort of how the next 45 minutes or so is going to go. There's a lot of legal considerations when you talk about this topic of festivals and carnivals and taste of events and other similar kinds of events. But one of the critical elements involves sales tax and understanding when you have to collect and remit sales tax associated with the various aspects of these kinds of events. And so we don't want to jump in and just say you have to pay sales tax. We want you to understand a little bit more about sales tax before we get into the specifics of the events. So we are grateful that we have Richard here, who's our sales tax expert, to provide that overview and to help us understand what it means, what sales tax is, and when and how you pay it in the state of Georgia specifically. And all the things that we're going to be talking about today are specifically focused on Georgia. Once we do that, then we're going to talk about a lot of the common aspects associated with these kinds of events. And you can see a list of those different things here. And so those are the things we're going to cover, sort of selling all the tickets, when you sell money, when you sell when you sell things, when you sell items, food, drink, ride participation events. What about food trucks and then the rides themselves, permitting, alcohol, insurance, and then of course corporate sponsorship, which is essential to a lot of these kinds of events. So we're going to get into all of that, but we're going to start with Richard's introduction to sales tax.
Great. Thank you, Robin, and welcome everybody. The sales tax is a transactions tax that's imposed on retail sales of tangible personal property and specified services. It's a tax imposed on the sale or lease also for any purpose other than for resale. That's what a retail sale is. So it includes rentals as well to the end user. Now, tangible personal property is basically any property that can be touched, measured, weighed. This pen is tangible personal property, a computer, boats, planes, computers, paper, canned software. It does not include real property. It does not include intangible property such as customized software or stock or bonds or trademarks. Now, the definition or the phrase retail sale also includes charges for admissions to places of entertainment, exhibition, sports, and amusement, or to a place where an admission charge is made. Voluntary contributions for admissions are not taxable. Retail sale also includes charges for participation in games and amusement activities, such as entry fees for golf tournaments. So those last two definitions of retail sale certainly apply in our case with what we're talking about this morning. Now, in 2019, by regulation, the Department of Revenue adopted a rule that charges for entry fees for fun runs, marathons, half marathons, walks, bicycle races, other non-motorized races are not charges for participation in games and amusement activities. So that's a carve out from the definition of retail sale. The third bullet point there is that tax must be added to the sales price or the purchase price as a separate line item. I know when we're talking about festivals and rides, we probably would just include it all as one charge, which you can do. You just have to keep a record of it. But if you're selling any kind of property, it's advisable that you add it as a line item. You add the tax as a line item. And then finally on this slide, tax is imposed on the sales price or the purchase price, whether it's cash, credit, property, or bartering services, that sort of thing. Sales price does not include retailer's discount. This is the Bed Bath & Beyond coupon. That's a retailer's discount. So any in-store discount is not subject to sales tax. Finance charges, separately stated installation charges, those things are not part of the sales price. Next slide, please. The use tax basically just is a complement of the sales tax. The focus here is on out-of-state or remote sellers that sell into Georgia and have to collect tax. It's not called a sales tax, but I like to refer to both of them as the sales and use tax so nobody gets confused. But the idea of the use tax originally was that you couldn't go into, if you lived in Augusta, you couldn't go into the state of South Carolina, buy something, have it shipped back to you in Georgia, and then not pay a tax. You wouldn't pay a tax in South Carolina because you didn't take possession of it. But then when you get into Georgia, you had to pay a tax. The idea was you couldn't avoid the tax in Georgia just because you had it shipped from another state. Obviously, the use tax has become much more important over the last several years. If you see in that second bullet point, with the focus on the out-of-state and remote sellers, which is beyond the scope of this presentation, but just understand that a lot of out-of-state sellers now have to collect Georgia tax, even though they don't have any kind of physical presence in Georgia, these out-of-state sellers. In effective January 1, 2020, that last bullet there, Georgia law does require out-of-state sellers to collect where they meet certain thresholds, $100,000 in retail sales or 200 separate transactions. The next slide, please. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one just because in Georgia we don't have a lot of services subject to sales tax. It's important to understand that unless the service is specifically enumerated as being subject to tax, it's not taxable in Georgia. Electricity is an enumerated service. Hotel rooms for less than 90 days, an enumerated service subject to sales tax. Services with minimal tangible personal property, such as a shoe repair or any other kind of service that's provided, maybe somebody who cleans the pool. Those are not subject to sales tax. Those are considered personal services. Then separately stated installation charges or charges for labor are not subject to sales tax either. I'm going to skip the last two items on this slide just because it doesn't come up a lot in the context of nonprofits. But it is important to understand that there are charges for fabrication labor and there's issues with mixed transactions. Next slide, please. So exemptions. We hear a lot of rules about exemptions. One of the biggest things that comes up in the area of nonprofits is you think, well, I'm a nonprofit, I'm exempt from income tax, so therefore I'm exempt from every other tax, which I guess most of us know that's not the case. Nonprofits certainly now need to be aware that you have to collect sales tax and you have to pay sales tax. But in general, there are some exemptions that could apply to nonprofits. I want to talk briefly about just the general rules of exemptions. First of all, exemptions are not found in a regulation. They're all statutory, and there's about 150 of them in the Georgia Sales and Use Tax Code. There are three types of exemptions. There's entities, certain entities that get exemptions. The most famous one is the Rock Eagle 4-H Club is exempt from having to pay sales tax. There's also use-based exemptions. So I may go and buy ice somewhere and I have to pay sales tax on it. But if I'm using the ice to chill vegetables at my vegetable stand, that's not considered taxable. And then there's product-based. The ones that come to mind are prescription glasses, prescription drugs, certain kinds of food that you buy in the grocery store are not subject to sales tax. So those are the three different types of exemptions. And then finally on that slide, one thing to remember about exemptions, if you think an exemption applies, but you're not sure because you don't understand the language of the statutory exemption, they're going to be construed narrowly against the exemption applying, which makes sense. So if you don't know if an exemption applies, just understand the black letter rule that exemptions are going to be applied narrowly. If there's any ambiguity, it probably doesn't apply. Next slide. Exemption certificates. I've got a copy of one right there. The ST5 is the standard one in Georgia. And these are important, especially in the area of selling product. A retail sale in most states is going to be presumed, even if you sell to a wholesaler for resale, it's going to be presumed to be a retail sale until you provide proof that it's not a retail sale. And one way to provide proof is a properly completed Form ST5. So if you get a properly completed retail or resale or exemption certificate that is given to you in good faith, meaning that you know and the purchaser knows that this is a valid purchase for resale and it's not something where they're buying jewelry at the apparel mart and they're really not going to sell it, they're just going to use it for themselves. That's important too. To understand that if you're going to take a resale certificate or an exemption certificate, you have to take it in good faith. You have to understand and know that whoever's buying the product is actually going to resell it or is indeed exempt as a purchaser. If you don't have that exemption certificate and you fail to collect the tax, you're going to be liable for the tax. So understand, if somebody does not give you an exemption certificate, but they say they're exempt, you got to collect the tax until they give you the exemption certificate. Next slide. Okay, let's talk about sales tax exemptions and purchases. Not talking about sales, but purchases. In general, by regulation, a nonprofit cannot buy anything tax exempt. And this applies to churches, religious organizations, charitable organizations, civic organizations. They must pay sales tax on purchases of items for their own use. They buy, I don't know, equipment, computers, they have to pay sales tax. Some exemptions, as you see in the last bullet point, allow specific entities to buy items tax exempt. If you'll go to the next slide, please. And these are some of the specific entities that aren't identified in the Georgia Sales Tax Code that can buy items tax exempt without having to pay sales tax. So you see, it's not a lot. It's a narrow list. Some 501c3s actually require a commissioner letter, as you see there on this slide, just to give you an understanding of which purchasers can buy things tax exempt. Next slide. And then you see some more entities here. Of course, the University System of Georgia and its educational units, some purchases by private colleges and universities whose credits are accepted by the University System of Georgia. And then of course, private elementary schools and secondary schools can buy food, can buy items used exclusively for educational purposes, purchases by a foreign government. Next slide. Let's go to sales and sales tax exemptions on sales by nonprofits. So this is where a nonprofit makes sales. And as I said in the beginning, if you make a sale, as Robin alluded to, you got to collect the tax. So if you charge somebody to enter a venue for a festival, you got to charge tax. There are some entities that do not have to charge tax. They're just relieved from the obligation to collect sales tax. The first one there are PTAs. As long as the PTA is an exempt 501c3 organization, they do not have to collect sales tax on anything that they sell. Certain private or public school events, such as tangible personal property or concessions or tickets for admission to an event or a function, but the net proceeds, this is the qualifier, from the sales must be used to benefit the school or the students, and the school has to pay sales tax on the purchase of the item. So let's say the school goes out and buys, 150 dozen Krispy Kreme donuts to sell. They have to pay sales tax on the purchase of those donuts, but they don't have to collect sales tax when they sell it. And then of course, the Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts, they don't have to collect sales tax. They don't have to pay sales tax. They're exempt up and down. And then finally, the last bullet point on this slide is religious institution fundraising. So this is where the religious institution is selling things to raise money. There are some conditionals that I'm not going to go into, but understand if you're a religious institution and you make sales for a specific event that's going to benefit the church, the synagogue, the mosque, there are situations where those sales are exempt. Next slide, please.
So Richard, just to confirm, all these things that you just laid out, where all these either entities or items for purchase that are exempt are all listed right in the statute.
That's correct? Everything I'm talking about is listed in the statute. You're not going to see it in a regulation. And that takes us to the rates in Georgia. Of course, you see the photo or the map of Georgia. We have 159 counties we have to be aware of. They all have different rates. The one thing I want you to understand about this slide is that third bullet point is if we're going to be selling things across in the various counties in the state, we collect sales tax based on the delivery address for the product. So if we're selling to somebody in Tattnall County, we collect the Tattnall County tax. If we're selling to somebody in Hancock County, we collect the Hancock County tax. Now for events, we collect the tax based on where the event is going to occur. So if we're a Cobb County organization and we're going to have an event down in the middle of Buckhead somewhere, we collect the City of Atlanta sales tax, even though the organization is in Cobb County. Next slide. Okay, how do you collect the tax? What do you do about collecting the tax? As I said earlier, if you look on that second bullet point, the seller has to add the tax to the invoice. When you're collecting the tax, you're doing it as an agent of the state. You file a monthly sales tax report. It's called a Form ST3. It's all done online. The Department of Revenue, if it chooses, can also collect from the purchaser. So if you have a situation where you purchase something online, like maybe 10 laptop computers for your organization, but the seller just for whatever reason, did not collect sales tax, you can be liable for what we referred to earlier as the use tax. That's what it's called, the consumer use tax. So I have plenty of clients that have been audited by the Department of Revenue, and they say to me, well, Richard, we weren't charged the sales tax, so why do we have to pay the sales tax? The understanding I want you to grasp from this slide is that the state can go after the purchaser or the seller. It doesn't really matter. But as you'll see on that last bullet point there, now that we're in this environment post-Wayfair, where we have a lot of economic statutes, economic nexus laws, certainly the one we have in Georgia effective January 1, 2020, it basically requires large internet retailers to collect the tax for the state of Georgia. So in most situations, if you buy from out of state, you'll see that the tax was collected. Next slide. Obligations of nonprofits for sales and use tax. As the seller, of course, you should be registered. If you're not registered and you have been making sales, that's an issue you have to take up with counsel, because you can't just register effective today. You have to go through a voluntary disclosure program that most states have, and Georgia Department of Revenue has, to register. Then every month, you have to file a Form ST3. If you don't make a lot of sales every month, they will reduce you from monthly to quarterly after 6 months. And then after another 6 months, they will reduce you to annual filing if maybe you only have a few sales per year. Everything is done electronically. We have online, pretty user-friendly online portal in Georgia. The second bullet point is purchaser. You also have to register. I say to every business in Georgia, you need to be registered. Whether you sell product or not, you need to be registered, because you're a business, and all businesses need to be registered for sales tax and start filing returns, even if you have 0 sales or 0 purchases. If as a purchaser you register, you either pay the sales tax or you provide an exemption certificate if you're exempt. And then if you buy things from out of state where they don't collect the tax, you pay the use tax. Next slide. So this is just one bulletin that was issued in 2017. Of course, we have the big one that was issued earlier or middle part of 2020 that Robin is going to talk about. But in 2017, the department issued a bulletin that basically said 3 things. That charges for participation in games and amusement activities are subject to sales tax. So that's very important that we all understand that if we're going to have an event that involves any kind of amusement, that involves games, we have to collect sales tax. Number 2, they said that there's an imposition of sales tax on the sales of tickets or fees or charges for admissions to places of amusement, and that would include any kind of festival or an event, where it's roped off. Any place where a fee is charged, you'll see in that sort of in the middle of the page there. So it doesn't matter what you're charging for. If you charge somebody to come into a room to breathe for 10 minutes, you have to collect sales tax. That's how I interpret this statute and this bulletin. So the one thing I want everybody to understand as we segue into Robin's presentation is entry fees are taxable charges. Charges for admission are taxable charges. And that's a nice little segue into Robin's presentation. I don't know if we have any questions before we head into Robin's presentation.
No questions yet.
Okay. All right. Good. And I'll turn it over to Robin.
All right. Thank you, Richard. That was really helpful. I appreciate your time and insights. If we could turn to the next slide. So as Richard alluded to, in July of 2020, the Department of Revenue issued a bulletin, and in it they said that this bulletin supersedes a bulletin that came out in 2013 that kind of addressed fundraising issues. But the idea of this was to address a variety of fundraising activities for 501c3 organizations. And actually about 4 years ago, the then tax commissioner of the state of Georgia, Lynn Riley, put together this committee to put out this kind of a bulletin to educate nonprofits about what their sales tax obligations are. And Richard and I were both on that committee. And this is really the results of that. We tried to provide very specific, practical advice in this bulletin so that our clients would understand what their responsibilities are. Now, what it does do is it puts 501c3s on notice, and this is exactly why they put this committee together and wanted to put out this bulletin, was to say, look, y'all have always been subject to sales tax and liable for it, where you either purchase things or sell things. And now we're going over and explaining all those various circumstances. And so now we're going to look at whether or not you're complying more than perhaps they have in the past. So just be aware of that. The bulletin walks through 13 different fundraising activities, including the ones we're going to cover today. And there is a link to it on our website. So I do recommend that you go ahead and take a look at that. I think it'll be, it's really insightful, and keep it and refer back to it as you do different fundraising activities. If we could turn to the next slide. So what are we talking about specifically today? Well, we're talking about sort of festivals, block parties, taste of events, carnivals, fairs. Anytime you're bringing a group of people together, which of course we're really not doing that right now, but in normal circumstances, you know, where you're bringing a group of people together to engage in some kind of fun entertainment type activities. Next slide, please. Oh, and as it notes in the notes down below in this webcast, this is the third, and as Sarisha alluded to, this is the third of a three-part series. So we've covered a bunch of other of the fundraising issues in two other webcasts, one involving galas and silent auctions, and one involving road races, golf tournaments, sporting events, and gambling. And so I recommend those two for those topics. Well, what are the commonalities of these events? Well, it's usually an area that's designated for an event, this kind of an event. That could be a public area. It could be 2-3 blocks of a downtown area of a community. It could also be private. It could be a private field. It could be, you know, parking lot. It could be a lot of different things. And so that's one of the commonalities, and we'll talk through some of that. In some cases, either way, it's got to be reserved in some way. You have to have some kind of agreement to or ability to use that space. And then in some cases, it may actually, like Richard said, be cordoned off, where you can't get in unless you pay usually or have access. But sometimes if it's on community streets, it's just open to anyone. So there's different scenarios. Commonalities are also entertainment, food and drink. A lot of times there's rides or games or booths, and then oftentimes there's items for sale. So we're going to cover some of these issues as we walk through the next few slides. All right, so let's start with admissions and ticket charges. And as Richard said, you know, if it's a restricted area and there's an entry fee, then you're paying for admission or entry for entertainment and amusement. And as a result, sales tax is charged. So if you are selling those tickets, you need to charge sales tax. Now I want to back up and say that sometimes these events are, the charity is coordinating with others. So it may be actually a community event really hosted by the town, but you are getting the revenue from it because they've chosen a charity to be the benefactor. And so they've asked you to run the ticket booth and to collect those tickets and then to keep that revenue. Well, it's still, if it's cordoned off, an entry fee, and you still have that responsibility of sales tax, right? So you need to kind of think through, what is your lane?
Are you going to cover including the ticket, the tax in the ticket price, or do you want me to? Okay, so basically, if you walk up and say, or you charge for admission, you're probably going to say it's $10 to get in. Now, you probably, this is probably a best practice. It's probably a good idea to give somebody a receipt that says the actual charge is, $8.58 plus $1.42 in sales tax. If you don't do that, you certainly should have records where you've backed out the tax, and for that $10 includes tax. And you certainly should have a sign somewhere that says admission fee or entry fee is $10, and that includes whatever the sales tax is, so that it's very clear both on your website and both at the day of event for walk-ups that you are telling the world that this price that they are paying is going to include a charge for sales tax. So there's no question about it. But you also have to have records of it. Otherwise, the Department of Revenue, if you get audited, is going to say, well, you charged $10. We don't see anywhere where you charged an additional amount for sales tax, so we're going to assume that the $10 was exclusive of sales tax, and you owe sales tax on all these $10 charges. That's my spiel on including sales tax.
Great. Excellent. So if you have that sort of restricted area and there actually is an entry fee, then you do need to collect that sales tax in whatever form that you do, whether it be on top of the ticket price or included in the ticket price. In addition, you're likely to have food and beverage tickets, and you might also have carnival and game type tickets, or you might only have those. If it's on the streets of, say, Alpharetta, then it might just be those separate tickets that you're selling. And I give that as an example. If we could turn to the next slide, we're going to get into food and beverage tickets first. Okay, so you're the charity and you're selling tickets for food and drink, and maybe there's booths set around or food trucks, and people can buy tickets and they can use those at the different locations to give those tickets and then get food and drink. Sometimes it's a taste. If it's a taste of, then you're getting a small taste, or it could be to buy a whole meal or a drink. So what's happening here is you're selling these tickets and people are using them to purchase tangible personal property. Well, that is a situation where sales tax must be collected because you're essentially selling tangible personal property to these folks. There's two common scenarios that I kind of want to talk about. So let's say a restaurant has a booth and they're donating the food to the charity so that the charity doesn't have to pay the restaurant for that food in any way. It does not matter if from a sales tax perspective, you still have to charge sales tax on those tickets. If the restaurants, though, are, let's say it's a taste of, and the restaurants are collecting all their tickets, and let's say a ticket costs $1, then, and maybe they're getting 25 cents for every ticket that is paid to the charity, so then they keep all their tickets and they go to the charity and they say, here are my 100 tickets, and you give them, 25 cents per ticket. In that case, the restaurant can now use that resale form that Richard talked about when buying their food ingredients. It doesn't really affect the charity, but it's just information to know you're still charging sales tax on the full amount. It's just what the restaurant can do if they're getting paid something for that, so that they're reselling their food, that they're buying the food ingredients for, that they're selling it as opposed to donating it. So that's something to keep in mind. Either way, as the charity, if you're selling these tickets for food and drink, you need to be charging sales tax, and then of course remitting it to the state. Next slide, please. Ride and game tickets. So let's say sometimes you use the same tickets, like you buy one set of tickets and it's for ride and games and food and drink. And then of course you're going to collect sales tax on any and all of it because ride and games is participation in games and amusement. So they're two different issues, right? One is the sale of tangible personal property. The other is the ability to participate in games and amusement. Either way, you're charging sales tax and the amount doesn't change. So you could use the same tickets. You may use separate tickets for whatever reason you want, but either way, you're charging sales tax. So what's the issue there? additional issues that arise. Well, if the games or the rides operator says, hey, you know, we'll set up for free. This is for charity. This is great. We're so supportive. Does that change the impact of this? Not at all. Not at all. But there are some issues you do need to think about when it comes to rides and games. And that is related to insurance. And we're going to cover those issues later on in this presentation. You know, is the ride and game operator bonded? Do they have a good reputation? Do they have good procedures to make sure those rides are safe? Do you get an indemnification from them to make sure that you're not liable for what they're doing? So those are some other things that relate to ride and games that you might have if you have a festival or a carnival or one of these kinds of events that you need to be thinking about. Next slide. And we're going to talk more about some of those other
especially
issues
bouncy houses.
Yes, especially bouncy houses. Those can be very dangerous. Booth, food, and truck space charges. So, you know, if you're setting up for one of these festivals and you've got all these booths and maybe there's 300 designated locations or there's spaces for food trucks to line up and set up, if you charge for those booth spaces, because again, you're trying to make money. This is a fundraising event for you. If you're charging for each booth space or you're charging for the food truck space, that does not have a sales tax obligation on it, because what you're doing is you're renting real property. You're saying, here's your physical space that I'm allowing you to use because I've got this area. Whether it's public or not, you should have gotten a permit if it's public, or you're doing it in connection with some kind of city or county potentially. And what you're really doing is renting that little square of property that they're going to be located on, where they can then sell their products, whether it be booths, craft booths, or food and drink, or businesses, sometimes businesses set up, or game booths, or whatever it may be. So there's no sales tax associated with that. But there are potentially other risks, and you need to think through the contract ramifications of allowing those folks to be on the property. And that's going to depend a little bit on what the property is. If you have rented private property and you're allowing these folks to set up on booths on this private property that you are now in control of, you may want some kind of release and indemnification from those folks. Or have some kind of simple contract with them about what they're permitted to do, not permitted to do, and that sort of thing. So those are some other aspects that you would need to think about. If it's on a public space, then you have to look at what your permit says if you're the one that got the permit. And you have to consider what the relationships are amongst the parties that are hosting this event on public property, and who's involved with that. We're going to talk about permitting a little bit later. Next slide, please. So one other common thing that comes up at these kinds of events is literally the sale of tangible personal property. Oftentimes the charity where they're selling their tickets might be selling t-shirts, sweatshirts, mugs for the charity itself, their logo or whatever. In that case, of course, the charity would need to collect and remit sales tax on those items. If the booth owners, you know, or renters are selling items, or the food truck where maybe people just are going up and paying for that food, that's all on them, right? So, but the booths, like, let's say they're selling craft items that they've made. It's an individual who has paintings or whatever it is that they're selling. That's up to each booth owner to collect and remit that sales tax, and you're not obligated to address any of those sales tax items. Only when there's sort of those tickets involved that you have to be concerned when it comes to those other booth folks. Now, there is one thing to think about going back to actually the charges for those spaces, and that is, and it's connected to this, also the sale of the items in their booth. You don't want to set up an arrangement where you're getting a percentage of their sales, or that's how they pay for their space or booth. That gets really complicated, and now you're getting involved in another entity's business. So, you need to be really careful about that. And it's much better to charge the flat fee for that space for them to be there at that booth, and then leave it up to them to sell whatever it is they're selling and collect whatever tax and have whatever risks associated with those sales just on that entity. Next slide, please. All right. Now let's talk briefly about these permits and licenses. So if it's a public space, you almost certainly have to get a permit to use that street or to close off streets. And this is something you kind of really need to be careful about. There's also potentially the need for a permit for a private space, depending on what you're doing. And so you need to be aware of what the local laws are and what your requirements are in that scenario. There's a common festival that takes place every year in the city of Atlanta, and they often try to ask a charity to get the permit, because if a charity gets a permit from the city of Atlanta, it costs a lot less than if a private company gets a permit from the city of Atlanta. But when you sign your name on that permit and you get that permit, all the liability associated with that festival or event can fall on you. So you really need to be careful about being that sort of front for that event if it's not really your event and you really don't want that liability, because you got to get the insurance that goes with it, which we're going to cover next after we get through the slide. So really think long and hard about who's signing for that permit and what those responsibilities are. And I don't want to scare you off of doing these things, because you can get insurance, you can do these events, they can be incredibly successful. But you need to think that through. And when you're working with other partners to put on one of these kinds of events, as a group, you need to consider all these issues and understand what your risks and liabilities are associated with it. And then make sure you're covered so that you don't end up in a bad situation. Is there a question? Should we stop for a question?
Yes, there is a question, and we could go ahead and address it now. It's from Becky, and she asks, what if the charity is hosting a festival and allows vendors to set up pop-up shops? Is it better for them to charge for the space, the rental space, and not ask the vendor to donate a percentage of their profit?
Yes, it's much better from the standpoint of, now this isn't a sales tax issue. This is, a pop-up shop, they're basically buying a booth. First of all, you want to treat all your vendors the same. But second of all, if they're donating, first of all, they're not donating a portion of their profit. I mean, they could do that, and then you don't get anything, and depending upon how much they raise. But if you do that, that's a co-venture arrangement. We've talked about those before, and under state law, you have to have a contract for that. And it's a pretty detailed contract. So it'd be much easier to charge them a standard booth rate and know that you're going to get a specific fixed amount, like $300 per booth or whatever it may be. And then you don't have to worry about making sure you're seeing their accounting for each of these pop-up shops and making sure that you're getting the amount that you should, and doing all those kinds of calculations. The much simpler, cleaner way to do it is to just charge that booth rental where there's no sales tax involved. But if you, under state law, have a co-venture arrangement, then which is the equivalent of a cause marketing scenario, which is come buy from me and I'm giving a portion of the proceeds to charity A. Well, that's all great and good, but you do have to have a contract, and state law lays out all the specifics of that.
Let me add,
Yes,
too,
Richard?
if you're going to do some kind of arrangement where you're working with the pop-up shop and you have a contract in place, and they're not collecting sales tax on their sales, you could run into some questions about whether, we as the charity, as the co-venture, is liable for the taxes that were not collected by the actual pop-up vendor.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. So going back to sort of permits and licenses, so think about the space you're using Is it public? Is it private? Either way, do you need a permit? And contact the local city, county, locale, and get answers to those questions. A lot of that information is often online, but it doesn't hurt to call and ask, and make sure you get that right. In addition, if you're serving alcohol in any way, you probably need an alcohol license, or whoever is serving it may need the alcohol license. We have a great webcast on this subject. It's called Bottoms Up, Serving Alcohol at Your Event. And there's the information on that. And of course, you can download these slides as a PDF, and it's in the bottom, well, I'm not exactly sure, but it's under Files. And so you can get that, or you can go onto our website and just type in serving alcohol and it should come up. But that's an important webcast to watch and understand what your responsibilities are from an alcohol perspective if you're serving that. And if you're selling those tickets and the tickets are used to get alcohol, then you're serving alcohol and you are responsible. You are selling the ticket for alcohol. So just keep that in mind when you're dealing with these kinds of big events. If alcohol is included in the ticket price, so let's say there's an entry fee. Let's say it's on a private big farm and there's an entry fee. And with your entry fee, you get a bracelet or a certain number of tickets. And you can use those tickets to get food and drink while you're in that space. Not only do you have to collect sales tax on that entry fee, but you are now selling that alcohol. So you need to be careful about that. Business license. You need to make sure, obviously, you have a business license, but you also need to check whether you need to do anything else if you're operating in an area that you don't normally operate in, and whether there's any additional licensure that you need for that, separate and apart from your permit. Usually not, but you also need to make sure your business license is up to date, and that's often required for your permit. And by the way, it's January, so you need to renew those business licenses to the extent you need one where you're located. Another aspect may be security, and that's something that's important to think about. So you need to think through what's happening, where it's happening, and what kind of security you may need to have in place to protect the community and to protect your participants and attendees. If you're on public streets, it may be that you have to engage with the local police and work that through with them. But you need to understand what the requirements are, what you can do, and then think through what you think you might need to do. If you're having an event in the evening and there's alcohol involved, you probably are going to want some kind of security to make sure that things don't get out of hand. Another factor is noise levels. So, usually, oftentimes there's entertainment with all of this. You've got a band playing, a stage set up, and there may be noise levels that you need to understand and respect for that community. And it may be that with this permit, you get some kind of exception till a certain time. So you need to think all of that through as well as you're planning and promoting and holding this event. Next slide, please. All right, so insurance. I've already sort of mentioned this, but it's really important to get event insurance. And you can go to your broker, your insurance broker, and say, we're having this very specific event and we need insurance for it. And they will give you a plan, an insurance plan for just this event. So it's important to tell them as much as possible about what you're planning and what's involved in the event and who's involved in the event. Also, city, county, state property may have minimum limits that you have to meet for these kinds of events. Often the permit says you have to have a certain amount of insurance. You may have to be bonded, other things. So you need to look into that and understand what those requirements are as well. So there's a little bit of a game of chess here as you put all these pieces together. Again, if you're serving alcohol, it's going to be really important for your insurance broker to know and understand that as well and what those risks are and have additional insurance related to that. And as we mentioned earlier, if you're providing games and rides, it's important to have insurance for that. Even if the vendor has their own insurance, you're going to at least want indemnification, and you're probably going to want your own insurance since this is overall your event. In the situations where maybe you're doing it with other entities, you also need to get together and figure out how that's going to work, because each of you could be liable. Everybody could get sued. And so you want to make sure you've got the indemnifications in place, or the responsibility is clear and the insurance is needed to protect your organization. My role is, of course, always to tell my clients how to protect themselves so that they can continue to do the great work that they do and to continue to help our community to thrive. So these are all the kinds of things you need to be thinking about. Next slide, please, unless there's a question. I don't think there are. All right, the last thing I want to briefly talk about is corporate sponsorships. So a lot of times charities will get corporate sponsors to support these kinds of events. They'll name it after that, the whole event maybe might be named after that corporation, or there's certain area, maybe one of the streets is, the name of that corporation is, there's, like 3 or 4 streets blocked off or something like that. And so, or they're just going to have a sign, or maybe they get their booth for free because as a sponsor, you're selling them that booth and they're giving you some additional funding over and above the booth. But the key to understand here, now we're getting sort of into an income tax area, is that advertising is considered unrelated business income. And hopefully you all understand that if you have a trade or business it's regularly carried on and it's unrelated to your mission, that you would have to pay income tax on that amount. But there's a way to make sure that corporate sponsorships are not considered advertising and you don't have to pay income tax on the revenue from it. And in the case of, I said, a trade or business regularly carried on, in the case of advertising, one-time advertising constitutes that regularly carried on, because there is no such, obviously if you have a magazine or some kind of online home where you're constantly, like a banner where you're constantly selling advertising, that's obvious, but even one time of selling advertising constitutes enough under the law. So that's why this becomes relevant and important. So there's a way to avoid that being considered advertising. When the corporation says, yes, we'll sponsor this event, you want to make sure you acknowledge them properly and don't over-acknowledge them. You want to make sure that you only list the name, logo, address, phone number, website of that entity, but you don't want to have any statements endorsing their products or services. You want to have all neutral information, and that neutral information includes not only qualitative but quantitative. So you don't want to say, go out and buy Coke because they're having a sale this week and support our sponsor and buy Coke for that reason. You don't want to say that they're the best. You can use their tagline so long as it's neutral. So for a while, Walmart had a tagline that made it very clear that you paid less if you bought at Walmart. You wouldn't want to use that tagline because it's quantitative. So you want to make sure that you can promote and thank your sponsors, but you don't want to tell people to go out and buy their products or services. You just want to point out that they're your sponsor and you so appreciate them. You can even say what they do. So like Allstate, Home Life Auto, but you're not going to say they've got the best insurance ever, so go buy it. So that's one aspect of qualified corporate sponsorship. And by the way, the Internal Revenue Code actually has a whole section that talks about and creates this qualified corporate sponsorship and separates it from advertising. So that's the first part. But the second part of it is making sure that you're not giving them a return benefit. So going back to that booth example, if they didn't pay for their booth and instead were just a sponsor, then they've gotten a substantial return benefit. Somebody next door to them is not a sponsor and they paid for that booth, or they got a discount on their booth. So you need to make sure that they're not getting a substantial return benefit. And if they are, then that's something, then that can't count as a donation to you. So it's really important to make sure that that's not happening. And they can get an insubstantial amount. And of course, the recognition and thanking them for being a sponsor does not count as a return benefit. But if you're going to give them something in return, it has to be really small. So let's say, let's use an insurance carrier. So an insurance broker decides they want to have a booth. And you say, great. And they're like, well, you know what? We'll sponsor you too. So maybe they're going to give you $1,000. And you say, well, we'll give you 10 tickets or 20 tickets so that you can go and get food and drink for free while you're there. But you have to calculate the value of those tickets and determine whether or not it's more than 2% of what they've paid. And if it is, then that needs to come out of their donation. Or it's all considered advertising, and that's what they paid for advertising. So you need to be kind of careful about that. This is a really complicated area. I was really just trying to introduce it to y'all, but we have an article and a webcast on this subject on our website. It goes into much more detail in this area, but it is something to be aware of if you're conducting one of these events. And with that, if we turn to the next slide, we are finished, other than if anybody has any additional questions, and we will stay and see if anyone adds anything into the chat room for a minute.
We did have one question from pre-registration where they were asking about indemnities or, waivers or notices for the people who are attending the event. Is that needed, and what should be incorporated into that?
Usually, I mean, you can do that. Usually, if people are just walking around and getting food and drink, you're not going to do that. Now, when you've got those games and rides, you might have that over in that area where people also maybe have to get a wristband and they have to sign off before they go into that bouncy or jumpy game, which, you know, kids do get hurt doing that, and adults. So from the game and ride perspective, that is the area where you would most often see the need for some kind of release, and where you might consider that. And it might be that the game or ride operator already has their own release, and you just want that indemnification with them to make sure you're not going to be held liable, or ask them to include you as a released party on those releases as well. But for just walking around at an event, usually you don't do that. You can, but you don't often see that. You can also have signs around, because you might also be taking pictures. So you might also want to have signs up saying that in this area, by buying this ticket, you've accepted to having your photograph taken and being used, if it's a private area. If they're on public streets, of course it's public, so you can take pictures, but you may still want to have that sign up around, set aside, that says that if you're in this area, we may take your picture and post it and use it, and you're giving permission by being here to do that, as well as sort of enter at your own risk, you know, if it's a closed off area.
Okay, so those, and then we have a question in the audience. Can those releases be put on the ticket as well?
Well, so the tickets that we were generally talking about are like the little small tickets that you use for food and drink. But if you're selling like a big ticket to enter, you can. And we've seen that. Of course, the risk is that, like, if I'm going online and I'm buying tickets for my whole family, my husband hasn't signed that release. I purchased the tickets and I'm getting that release and I'm agreeing to it, but he hasn't necessarily do that, and I can't do that for him because he's his own person. So that's the risk in doing it that way. It's a good starting point. It's not a bad way to go in terms of in general, but it's not going to be foolproof.
And it looks like we have one more question. If we discover that our nonprofit didn't pay sales tax on event entry tickets from an event in 2018 or 2019, how should we follow up?
Richard? You're on silent.
Okay. The way to do that is through what's called a voluntary disclosure. It's done through counsel, where the attorney approaches the Department of Revenue and says, hey, I've got this nonprofit in North Georgia. I won't tell you who they are, but they didn't collect sales tax on an event back in 2018 or 19. This is the total sales tax they should have collected. We'd like to come forward now and register and get into compliance going forward. Now, typically they don't do that at the Department of Revenue, but with a nonprofit, I always ask for that. Can we just do it going forward? If the Department of Revenue does not allow that, then the Department of Revenue will say, we need the money that you should have collected and did not collect, and we're going to charge you interest. We will not charge you any penalty. And typically the Department of Revenue goes back 3 years. So we're at the beginning of January right now. They would go back to 17. So, 18. So 18, 19, and 20 would be the 3 years that they would go back for any taxes not collected. Even if you didn't collect it, you should have collected it. And so they will ask you as the vendor or the seller to pay that tax. But again, if I were representing the nonprofit, I would always ask, in light of the confusion and now that we have a bulletin out, can we possibly collect it on a going forward basis? No guarantees, but that's how I would handle it.
So if you're a Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta client, reach out to your Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta attorney and talk with them about it, and then we can try and find an attorney to help you with that. I think there's one other question. What type of release would you need if you're transporting youth to an event? Well, it depends on your relationship to those youth. It depends on if you have any other releases for those youth with their guardians. And it would be the case of transporting them anywhere. It's like a permission slip. And have you been given permission by their guardians to participate in these kinds of events and to transport them? So again, it kind of depends on the full relationship with those children.
Well, I think
with that.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you for answering that question. And I think we are up for time. But this has been great information. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Robin, for sharing your expertise with us today. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. And thank you for continuing to do all the great work that you do in the community. Have a good day.
Thank you.